The end of the year has a way of softening the air around us. Mornings feel quieter than they did a few months ago. Even light seems to arrive more gently, as if it knows we are carrying a lot that doesn't need to be stirred too quickly. There's often a pause that happens without asking for permission, somewhere between waking and fully beginning the day. I've noticed that pause feels different now after everything this year held. Over the years, I've learned that the last days of a year don't ask us to judge anything. They don't ask for summaries or conclusions. They simply create space. And in that space, certain moments from the year tend to rise on their own, not the loud ones, not always the obvious ones, but the quieter scenes that stayed with us longer than we expected. You might have already felt that happening. A memory appearing while you're making coffee. A feeling returning while you're looking out the window. Not demanding attention, just standing there waiting to be noticed. I wonder if you've sensed how different that feels compared to earlier years when endings felt more rushed, more pressured to become something tidy. This year asked a lot of people to slow down in ways they didn't plan for. Not always gently, sometimes through delays, sometimes through silence, sometimes through situations that never explained themselves. There were moments when effort didn't lead where it usually does. Moments when being strong wasn't the right response anymore, even if it had worked before. There's something about 2025 that feels less about achievement and more about endurance. Not the kind that pushes forward loudly, but the kind that learns how to stay present, stay open, stay honest about what can no longer be carried the same way. You may have noticed that certain expectations quietly loosened their grip this year, not because you decided to let them go, but because they simply stopped fitting. The version of yourself that once held them changed shape, almost without announcement. It's subtle when that happens. You don't realize it in the moment. Only later, when you notice you're no longer reaching for the same things with the same urgency. Sometimes what stands out most at the end of a year isn't what happened, but what didn't. Conversations that never took place, plans that dissolved before they could become real, hopes that were neither fulfilled nor broken, just set aside. There's a tenderness to that kind of ending. It doesn't demand grief, but it doesn't disappear either. I found that mornings are often when those unspoken parts surface. The day hasn't yet filled itself with noise or intention. There's room to notice how the body feels carrying a year like this. How certain emotions feel less sharp now, even if they haven't fully faded. How some disappointments feel less personal than they once did. You may have realized that some things you blamed yourself for earlier in the year no longer feel like personal failures. Time has a way of adjusting the lens. What once felt like a mistake may now look more like a turning, not towards something specific, just away from what wasn't sustainable anymore. There's a difference there, you may have noticed. This year also seemed to reveal where energy naturally goes when it's no longer forced. Some relationships deepened without effort, others quietly moved to the background without drama. That kind of reordering doesn't come from decision-making. It comes from honesty that happens beneath thought. There were probably moments this year when rest felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, as if slowing down required more courage than pushing through. That says something about how much you've learned to carry without stopping, and maybe also about how this year gently challenged that habit again and again. It's interesting how the end of a year invites reflection without insisting on answers. Questions arise that don't need to be solved, like noticing what felt heavier than it needed to be, or recognizing what felt surprisingly steady when everything else shifted. Those observations don't ask for action. They simply settle into awareness. You might find that certain memories from early in the year feel distant now, even though not much time has passed, as if the person who lived them isn't quite the same, one listening now. That change doesn't announce itself. It just becomes apparent in moments of stillness. There's often a quiet relief in realizing you don't need to carry the whole year forward. Not every emotion, not every lesson, not every unresolved moment. Some things were only meant to be lived, not preserved. Others stay because they softened you, not because they wounded you. I've noticed that years like this tend to leave behind a different kind of strength. Not confidence, not certainty, but steadiness. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind that recognizes limits without judgment. the kind that knows when to pause. As the morning continues, you might sense how the body responds to that steadiness, breathing a little more evenly, shoulders not holding quite as much, thoughts moving without urgency. It's not a resolution, it's more like an exhale that's been waiting for permission. There's no requirement to make sense of 2025 right now. Understanding often comes later in pieces when it's no longer needed for survival. For now, noticing is enough. Allowing is enough. Letting the year rest where it belongs is enough. And perhaps there's a quiet recognition that whatever didn't unfold the way it was imagined still shaped something important. Not in a dramatic way, just in the way time shapes stone, slowly, without explanation. If you find yourself sitting with a sense of calm that feels unfamiliar, that may be the year loosening its hold. If there's a trace of sadness mixed with relief, that too belongs here. Endings rarely arrive as one clear emotion. The morning light keeps moving, whether we interpret it or not. And in that steady movement, there's space to simply be here with what remains from this year without trying to turn it into anything else. As the day settles into itself, there's often a gentle awareness that the year didn't pass the way anyone expected it to. Not in the dramatic sense people talk about, but in the quieter way plans adjusted themselves without asking. You may have noticed how often you adapted without calling it resilient. You simply did what was needed then, kept moving, then paused when you could. There were stretches of this year that felt longer than the calendar suggested, weeks that carried more weight than usual. And then, unexpectedly, there were days that passed almost unnoticed, leaving behind a sense of calm rather than memory. It's interesting how time reshapes itself depending on what we're holding. You might recall moments when you realized something you'd been waiting for no longer mattered in the same way. Not because it arrived or disappeared, but because the need for it softened. That kind of shift doesn't come from effort. It comes from living through enough moments where the old urgency simply doesn't survive. This year also seemed to bring clarity about what no longer needs explanation. Situations where you once felt compelled to justify yourself may have lost their power. Silence may have started to feel less like absence and more like space. There's a difference there that becomes noticeable only after time has done its work. Over the years, I've seen how endings invite a different kind of honesty. Not the kind that demands confession, but the kind that allows recognition. Recognizing where energy was spent wisely. Recognizing where it was drained without return. Recognizing what remained steady, even when conditions changed. There may have been moments this year when you surprised yourself by how little reaction something received. News that once would have unsettled you deeply, now passing through with less disturbance. That isn't indifference, it's discernment forming quietly. You may have felt a growing comfort with not knowing what comes next, not because uncertainty disappeared, but because it stopped feeling like a threat. There's a quiet maturity in that shift. It doesn't announce itself. It just changes how the body responds to unanswered questions. Some parts of this year ask for patience in unfamiliar ways. Waiting without clear timelines, trusting processes that didn't offer reassurance, learning to stay present without the promise of immediate clarity. That kind of waiting leaves its mark, but not as weariness, more like depth. It's possible that certain connections change shape this year without either side naming it. Conversations becoming fewer but more honest. Distance feeling less like loss and more like alignment. There's often relief hidden inside those changes even when they weren't chosen consciously. As the year draws closer to its end, reflection tends to move away from events and toward atmosphere. How it felt to live through these months, what kind of inner weather became familiar, whether calm arrived gradually or in brief moments that mattered more than they appeared to at the time. You may notice how certain fears that once felt urgent now feel quieter, not resolved, just less dominant. They're still present, but they no longer define the landscape. That shift doesn't erase anything. It simply reorders importance. Mourning has a way of revealing that kind of reordering. The mind isn't yet filled with intention. The body hasn't committed to the day. There's room to sense what feels lighter now and what remains because it belongs rather than because it's heavy. This year may have taught something about boundaries without ever using the word, about knowing when to stop explaining, when to step back, when to allow things to unfold without intervention. Those lessons don't feel like achievements. They feel like settling. I've noticed that years like this often leave behind a quieter confidence, not certainty about outcomes, but trust in one's ability to remain steady regardless of them. That kind of confidence doesn't ask to be seen. It simply exists. There's also a tenderness that emerges when looking back without the need to fix anything. Tenderness for moments that didn't turn out as hoped, for versions of yourself that tried hard, for choices that made sense at the time, even if they led somewhere unexpected. You may find that gratitude appears in a different form now, not attached to specific outcomes, but to endurance itself, to having stayed present, to having noticed when something needed to change, even if the change wasn't immediate. As this morning continues, there's no need to carry conclusions forward. The year doesn't require them. It's enough to acknowledge what passed through and what remains. Enough to allow the quiet understanding that something essential was learned even if it can't yet be named. We can let the year rest here for a moment longer. As the hours of the year narrow toward their final shape, there's often a softer quality to attention. Thoughts don't rush as quickly. They move with more space between them. You may have noticed how certain memories from this year now arrive without the charge they once carried. They come, they linger briefly, and then they pass, leaving behind something calmer than explanation. There were moments in 2025 that asked for adjustment rather than action. Times when doing less was the only honest response. That can feel unfamiliar at first, especially if you've spent years equating movement with progress. Yet something different happens when stillness becomes part of the rhythm. You begin to sense what actually needs your energy and what never did. You might remember a point in the year when you realize you were no longer arguing with reality in the same way. Situations that once sparked internal resistance began to meet a quieter acceptance, not approval, just recognition. There's a subtle relief in that shift, one that doesn't need to be explained to anyone else. This year also carried lessons about timing that couldn't be hurried, about how some answers arrive only after the question has softened, about how clarity often waits until urgency leaves the room. Those lessons don't feel dramatic when they arrive. They feel almost ordinary, which is how you know they're real. You may have noticed how your relationship with effort changed, how pushing harder stopped feeling like the solution it once was, how listening became more useful than insisting. That kind of recalibration doesn't come from failure. It comes from having lived long enough to recognize patterns before they fully repeat. There were likely moments when you felt unexpectedly grounded, even while circumstances remained uncertain, a steadiness that didn't depend on outcomes. It might have surprised you at first. That steadiness isn't loud, it doesn't declare itself, it simply holds. Sometimes toward the end of a year, there's an awareness that certain struggles no longer define you, even if they haven't completely resolved. They've moved from the center to the edges, still present but no longer in charge. That repositioning matters more than resolution ever could. Morning light has a way of highlighting that truth. It doesn't ask what you plan to do next. It simply arrives. And in that arrival, there's a reminder that presence doesn't require effort. It's already happening. You might find yourself reflecting less on what you gained this year and more on what you released. Expectations that quietly dissolved. Roles that no longer fit. Narratives about yourself that grew tired and finally loosened their hold. Letting go rarely feels triumphant. It feels like relief mixed with unfamiliar space. There's often a question that surfaces at this point in the year, not one that needs an answer, just one that drifts through awareness. Something about what feels true now compared to what once felt urgent. It doesn't demand clarity, it simply invites noticing. This year may have shown you that peace isn't something that arrives after everything settles. It appears in fragments often while things are still unfinished. Brief moments when the body relaxes despite uncertainty. Those moments matter more than they seem at the time. You may also sense that certain hopes change shape, not abandoned, just adjusted, less tied to specific outcomes, more aligned with how you want to feel while living. That kind of hope doesn't ask for guarantees. It rests more easily. As the year draws closer to its end, there's no need to summarize it. Years like this resist being condensed. They leave behind impressions rather than statements, sensations rather than conclusions. And that's enough. There's something quietly reassuring in realizing you don't need to carry everything forward. Some experiences did their work simply by being lived. Others leave a residue that informs without burdening. Knowing the difference comes naturally now. The morning continues to unfold at its own pace. And within that pace, there's room to let 2025 settle into its place without ceremony, without judgment, without the need to extract meaning too quickly. There's often a moment near the end of a year when the mind stops trying to organize everything it has lived through. It's not exhaustion, it's more like recognition. A quiet understanding that not everything needs to be sorted, labeled, or carried forward with intention. Some things were only meant to pass through, leaving behind a subtle shift rather than a clear lesson. You may have felt that shift without naming it. A sense that your inner pace no longer matches the speed of expectation around you, that what once felt urgent now feels optional, that choosing calm doesn't require justification anymore, it simply feels appropriate. This year seemed to refine attention, not by adding focus, but by removing distractions that no longer held meaning. You might have noticed how certain concerns lost their pull, how you stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened, how silence became less something to fill and more something to rest inside. There were moments in 2025 when strength looked different than it used to, less about endurance through force, more about discernment, knowing when to stay engaged and when to step back. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly, often, after enough repetition has made its point. Sometimes, toward the end of a year, the body remembers before the mind does. A feeling of ease in places that once held tension, a gentler response to situations that used to tighten everything inside. Those changes don't come from effort, they come from time doing its work. You might recall a moment when you realized you didn't need to explain yourself anymore, not because others changed, but because the need dissolved. That realization doesn't arrive with clarity, it arrives with relief. This year also brought reminders about limits, not as failures, but as information. Understanding where energy naturally ends, where rest isn't avoidance, but respect. That awareness tends to arrive after enough pushing has shown what it cost. There's a question that sometimes drifts through awareness at this point, not demanding an answer. Something like whether peace now feels more familiar than intensity ever did. It doesn't need resolution, it simply rests there. As mornings became quieter toward the end of the year, you may have noticed how your thoughts softened too. Less rehearsing, less anticipation, more presence with what's already here. That's not a decision. It's a settling. There's often gratitude woven into that settling, even if it isn't named. Gratitude for having stayed with yourself through uncertainty, for not abandoning what mattered when outcomes were unclear, for allowing change to happen at its own pace. This year may have shown you that understanding doesn't always arrive through reflection. Sometimes it arrives through living, through repetition, through letting the same pattern play out until it loses its hold. That kind of understanding doesn't feel like insight. It feels like quiet release. You may notice that certain regrets feel lighter now, not erased, just less insistent. Time has a way of returning perspective gently without forcing forgiveness or forgetting. Just enough distance to breathe. There's a different quality to hope at the end of a year like this, less attached to specific scenarios, more aligned with steadiness, with being able to meet whatever comes without losing yourself in it. That hope doesn't need encouragement. It already knows how to stay. The morning continues unhurried, and in that unhurried space, there's room to let the year finish its work without interference, to allow what remains to remain, to allow what's ready to leave to do so quietly. We can stay here a little longer. As the year moves closer to its final days, there's often a subtle shift in how the past presents itself. It doesn't arrive as a list or a story. It arrives as a feeling, a texture, something you recognize without having to revisit every detail. The mind seems less interested in recounting and more interested in resting. You may have noticed how certain moments from earlier in the year now feel smaller, not because they weren't important, but because they found their place. They no longer need to be revisited to be understood. They've settled where they belong. This year carried its own rhythm, one that didn't always match intention. There were pauses that arrived uninvited, interruptions that rearranged priorities without explanation. Over time, those interruptions may have revealed what continued to matter even when structure fell away. There's a quiet kind of wisdom that forms when plans loosen their grip, when control gives way to attention, when noticing becomes more valuable than directing. That wisdom doesn't come with confidence, it comes with ease. You might recall moments when you felt unexpectedly calm in the middle of something unresolved. Not because it resolved, but because you realized you could remain present anyway. That discovery changes something fundamental. It doesn't remove uncertainty, it changes how it's held. Toward the end of a year, there's often an awareness of how much you've already integrated without noticing. Adjustments made quietly, habits softened, reactions shortened. Those changes don't ask to be celebrated. They simply exist as part of you now. There's also a gentleness that emerges when comparison fades, when the sense of where you should be loses urgency. This year may have taught that progress isn't always visible. Sometimes it's internal. Sometimes it's the absence of struggle, where there once was plenty. You may have felt moments when solitude felt less like isolation and more like clarity, when being alone carried a sense of alignment rather than lack. That distinction doesn't announce itself. It's felt in the body first. As mornings grew quieter toward the year's end, you might have noticed how the day no longer needed to begin with urgency, how starting slowly didn't feel like falling behind. That change doesn't come from discipline. It comes from trust in pacing. This year may have softened your relationship with effort, showing that not everything responds to force, that some things respond only to time, attention, and patience. Learning that doesn't feel like learning. It feels like relief. There's often a question that surfaces now, not one that needs to be answered. Something about what feels essential moving forward, not in terms of plans, but in terms of presence. It doesn't require clarity. It simply rests alongside awareness. You may notice that certain fears feel less convincing now. Not gone, just quieter. Less able to take over the entire landscape. That shift matters more than resolution ever could. As the year prepares to close, there's no need to extract meaning from every experience. Some moments shaped you without leaving a message. Others leave behind a sense of grounding that doesn't need interpretation. The morning continues to unfold, steady and uncomplicated. And within that steadiness, there's room to let the year complete itself, to allow what has already integrated to remain, to let the rest dissolve without effort. As the final stretch of the year comes into view, there's often a quiet awareness that nothing needs to be carried across the threshold all at once. The year doesn't end with a demand. It ends with a soft closing, the way a room settles after conversation fades. You may have felt that settling begin already, even before the calendar confirms it. There's a gentleness in realizing that you don't owe the year an explanation. You lived it. That's enough. The moments that mattered found their way into you without needing to be named. The moments that didn't belong are already loosening, even if you haven't consciously released them. This year seemed to teach something about pacing that couldn't be learned any other way. About how moving slower didn't mean losing momentum. About how stopping didn't erase direction. Those understandings tend to arrive only after urgency has exhausted itself. You might notice that your inner voice sounds different now than it did months ago. Less sharp, less insistent, more spacious. That change doesn't come from effort. It comes from having listened long enough to know what doesn't need to be repeated. There were likely moments this year when uncertainty felt less threatening than it once did. Not because answers appeared, but because your capacity to stay present expanded. That expansion doesn't announce itself. It's felt in how you breathe through unanswered questions. Sometimes near the end of a year, there's a recognition that you're no longer trying to become someone else, that the work shifted from improvement to alignment, from striving to settling. That shift doesn't require celebration. It feels quietly right. You may have noticed how certain emotional patterns lost their intensity, reactions that once lingered now passing more quickly. That's not detachment, it's familiarity. The nervous system learning that not every signal requires the same response. This year may also have changed how you relate to beginnings. You might feel less pressure for the next chapter to be different in obvious ways, more openness to letting it unfold naturally. That openness isn't passive, it's attentive. There's often a softness that comes when reflection no longer needs to prove anything. When looking back isn't about justification or evaluation, but about noticing how life moved through you. That kind of reflection doesn't require effort. It happens in the background. You may find that certain emotions surface now without a story attached. A trace of sadness without regret, a sense of gratitude without a list, a calm that doesn't need a reason. Those emotions don't ask to be understood. They simply pass through. As the morning light continues its steady presence, there's reassurance in its consistency. It doesn't change its tone for endings. It doesn't rush to make room for what comes next. It simply continues inviting you to do the same. There's no requirement to prepare yourself for what follows this year. Preparation often happens quietly beneath awareness. You've already adjusted in ways that matter. You've already learned what needed to be learned through living. We can allow this moment to remain simple. No summary, no intention setting, just the recognition that the year is finishing its work and you're here to notice it. As the year draws even closer to its close, there's often a feeling that the mind has said what it needed to say. What remains doesn't arrive as thought, but as sensation, a sense of quiet completion that doesn't require certainty. You may have noticed how some questions no longer ask to be answered. They simply rest. There's a subtle dignity in that kind of resting. It suggests that something has been integrated deeply enough that it no longer needs attention. This year may have carried moments that felt unresolved at the time, yet now feel settled without explanation. That doesn't mean clarity arrived, it means acceptance did. You might remember earlier in the year how effort felt more charged, how wanting something to change carried tension with it. Now that tension may feel softer, not gone, but less demanding, as if the grip loosened on its own. This year also seemed to invite a different relationship with patience. Not the kind that waits while watching the clock, but the kind that waits without measuring. That patience doesn't feel like discipline. It feels like trust developing quietly. You may have noticed that your attention has become more selective. Certain worries simply don't enter the same way anymore. Certain narratives don't hold interest. That selectivity isn't avoidance, it's discernment forming naturally. There's often a moment near the end of a year when you realize you're not trying to fix anything. Not because nothing needs care, but because care doesn't always require correction. Sometimes it requires allowing things to be as they are for a while longer. This year may have shown you that steadiness isn't something you arrive at permanently. It comes and goes, but you've learned how to recognize it when it's present, and that recognition matters. You might feel a sense of quiet readiness now, not for a new beginning, but for continuity, for letting life keep moving without interruption. That readiness doesn't need enthusiasm. It feels calm. There's something reassuring in noticing that the body seems to know how to let a year end. Breathing adjusts, muscles soften, attention widens. These changes don't require intention. They happen when the pressure lifts. As the morning continues, there's no need to decide what comes next. The year doesn't ask for that. It simply completes itself. And in that completion, there's space to remain present without anticipation. We can stay with this simplicity. As the last days of the year settle in, there's often a quiet sense that the inner noise has thinned out, not disappeared, just softened. Thoughts feel less crowded, emotions feel less urgent. You may have noticed how the need to revisit certain moments has faded, not because they lost meaning, but because they've already done what they came to do. There's something gentle about realizing that memory doesn't need to be managed. The moments that matter return on their own, usually when you're not looking for them. A feeling, a tone, a subtle recognition. They arrive without explanation, and somehow that feels right. This year may have changed how you relate to effort in small, almost invisible ways. You might have stopped pushing in situations where pushing never truly helped. Or you may have noticed yourself choosing rest without having to justify it. Those shifts rarely feel significant while they're happening, yet they quietly reshape everything. You may remember how earlier in the year certain uncertainties felt heavy simply because they were unanswered. Now, those same uncertainties may feel lighter even if the answers still haven't arrived. There's a difference between not knowing and being unsettled by not knowing. That difference often emerges with time. There's often a moment near the end of a year like this when comparison loses its edge, where other people's timelines no longer feel relevant, where your own pace feels sufficient, even if it doesn't match any external rhythm. That realization doesn't feel like confidence. It feels like relief. This year may also have softened your relationship with expectation, not removing it entirely, but loosening its grip, allowing things to arrive as they are rather than as imagined. That doesn't close doors, it widens them. You might have noticed how your attention now gravitates toward what feels steady rather than what feels impressive, toward conversations that don't require performance, toward moments that don't need to be shared. That shift says something about what has become valuable. There's a quiet kind of gratitude that often appears here, not tied to outcomes, but to having stayed present through uncertainty, to having listened when something felt off, to having allowed yourself to change without forcing direction. As the morning continues, there's no pressure to turn reflection into intention. The year doesn't ask to be transformed into a plan. It simply asks to be acknowledged, then allowed to rest. You may sense that whatever comes next doesn't need to be approached with urgency. That readiness can be quiet. That beginning doesn't require a dramatic shift. Sometimes it's enough to keep moving at a pace that feels honest. The light keeps moving across the room, steady and unremarkable. And in that steadiness, there's permission to let the year finish without ceremony, to allow what has already settled to remain, to trust that what needs to emerge will do so in its own time. We can stay here a little longer without adding anything. As the year reaches the point where it no longer asks for attention, there's often a sense that reflection has become quieter on its own, not because there's nothing left to consider, but because consideration has done enough. What remains feels more like atmosphere than thought. You may notice how the body responds to that shift first, a sense of being less braced, less prepared for impact. Even without naming it, something inside recognizes that the need for vigilance has eased, not entirely, just enough to rest. This year may have shown that clarity doesn't always arrive through understanding. Sometimes it arrives through familiarity. Living with something long enough that it stops feeling foreign. That kind of clarity doesn't bring answers, it brings ease. You might recall how earlier in the year there was a tendency to anticipate what might happen next, to prepare mentally, emotionally. Now that anticipation may feel less necessary. The present moment holds more weight than the imagined future. That change doesn't require discipline, it feels natural. There's often a point near the end of a year when the desire to improve softens, not because growth isn't valued, but because growth has already occurred quietly. It doesn't need reinforcement. It's already part of how you respond to the world now. You may have noticed how certain emotional reactions shortened this year. Not disappearing, just resolving more quickly. The space between trigger and response widened. That widening creates room to choose, or simply to allow. This year also seems to have refined your sense of what deserves attention. Some things no longer call for analysis, others no longer feel personal. That discernment doesn't come from judgment, it comes from repetition and patience. There's a quiet reassurance in realizing that nothing needs to be concluded. Years like this don't end with statements, they end with a sense of settling, like dust finally returning to the ground after movement stops. You may feel less inclined now to explain your experience even to yourself. Words feel unnecessary. The understanding is already present, just not verbal. That's often how integration feels. As the morning continues, there's space to notice how little is required right now. Breathing, being awake, letting the day arrive without direction. These small permissions matter. The year doesn't need a closing thought. It doesn't need gratitude expressed or lessons identified. It simply needs to be allowed to finish where it is. We can let it do that. As the year completes its final movements, there's often a sense that even memory begins to quiet itself. What once returned with detail now arrives more softly, like an impression rather than a scene. You don't need to follow it. It knows where to settle. You may notice how little effort it takes now to stay present. Earlier in the year, presence may have felt like something to practice. Now it feels more like something that happens when nothing interrupts it. That shift doesn't draw attention to itself. It simply becomes the background. This year may have left you with a clearer sense of what drains you and what doesn't, not through analysis, but through experience. Certain situations reveal themselves by how the body responds afterward. That information stays with you without needing interpretation. You might recall moments when letting go happened without ceremony. No decision, no announcement, just a quiet absence where something used to be. Those moments are easy to overlook, yet they often matter most. There's a point near the end of a year when the mind stops searching for reassurance. Not because reassurance was found, but because it no longer feels necessary. The present moment carries enough weight on its own. You may feel a subtle readiness now, not for change, but for continuation. For allowing life to keep unfolding without needing to frame it as a beginning or an ending. That readiness feels steady, not anticipatory. This year may have shown that calm doesn't always come from resolution. Sometimes it comes from familiarity with uncertainty. Knowing how to remain yourself even when outcomes aren't clear, that knowledge doesn't announce itself, it's felt. As the morning continues, there's an ease in not having to name what this year meant. Meaning tends to surface later when it's no longer needed for orientation. For now, noticing is enough. The light keeps moving, the day keeps arriving, and the year, having done what it needed to do, settles into its place without asking for anything more. There's nothing to add here. As the year reaches the point where it almost feels finished before it actually is, there's often a gentle quiet that settles underneath everything else. It's not silence. It's more like nothing is pressing for attention anymore. You may have noticed how even thoughts seem willing to wait their turn. There's a subtle difference between reflecting and resting, and by now the year seems to be inviting the second. Reflection has already done what it could. What remains doesn't ask to be examined. It simply wants space to settle. You might feel how your relationship with time has shifted. Hours don't feel as tight. Mornings don't feel like something to get through. There's a sense that arriving fully is more important than moving quickly. That understanding doesn't come from discipline. It comes from experience. This year may have taught you that some things resolve themselves without being solved. That clarity can arrive as comfort rather than explanation. You may have felt that in moments when something no longer bothered you, even though nothing externally changed. There's often a quiet honesty that appears here. Not the kind that demands confession, but the kind that allows you to see what actually matters without forcing a response. You may have noticed how certain concerns simply stopped asking for energy. You might sense that your inner landscape feels less crowded now. Fewer arguments, fewer rehearsals, more room between thoughts. That space isn't emptiness, it's availability. As the year comes to rest, there's no pressure to prepare yourself for anything. Preparation has been happening quietly all along, through repetition, through patience, through allowing yourself to be shaped by what actually occurred, not by what was expected. You may notice a calm that feels unearned, not attached to accomplishment or relief. Just present. That calm doesn't need protection. It's steady enough to remain. The morning continues uncomplicated, light moving without instruction, breath finding its rhythm without effort. In that simplicity, the year completes itself naturally. As the year eases into its final position, there's often a sense that even the idea of closing something has softened. It doesn't feel like an ending that needs to be marked. It feels more like a settling, the way the body settles into a chair it knows well. Nothing dramatic, just a recognition that it can rest here. You may notice how little explanation feels necessary now. Earlier in the year, there may have been a need to understand, to interpret, to make sense of what was happening as it unfolded. Now understanding feels less urgent. What mattered has already shaped you in ways that don't require language. There's something quietly reassuring about realizing that not every experience needs to be integrated consciously. Some things become part of you simply because you lived through them. They don't announce themselves as lessons. They show up later as steadiness, as restraint, as an ease you didn't plan. This year may have shifted how you listen to yourself. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quieter one. Pausing sooner, noticing earlier, trusting what feels off without needing to prove it. That kind of listening develops slowly through repetition, not intention. You might sense that your inner world feels less reactive now. Not numb, just calmer. Emotions still move, but they don't pull as hard. There's more room around them. That room allows you to stay present without being overtaken. As the morning unfolds, there's a simplicity in how little is required of you right now. You're not being asked to decide anything, not being asked to resolve anything, just to notice what it feels like to be here at the end of a year that did its work quietly. You may find that gratitude appears without effort, not directed at specific events, but at the fact of having made it through with yourself intact. That kind of gratitude doesn't look outward, it rests inwardly. There's often a moment here when the future feels less like a question and more like a continuation, not something separate from what came before, but an extension of the same steady movement. That realization doesn't need enthusiasm. It feels calm. The light continues its slow movement. The day continues without urgency. And the year, having finished what it needed to do, no longer asks for attention. We can let it remain that way. As the year reaches the point where it no longer needs to be held in mind, there's often a quiet recognition that you're already standing on the other side of something. Not a clear milestone, not a turning point you could name, just a sense that the weight has shifted. What once felt immediate now feels distant enough to rest. You may notice that even your attention feels softer. It doesn't scan the horizon the way it used to. It doesn't brace itself. It simply stays where it is. That change doesn't come from certainty. It comes from having learned over time that you can remain present without being overwhelmed. This year may have altered how you relate to effort in ways that are difficult to describe. You might find yourself doing less, explaining less, defending less, trying to make things fit, not because you've given up, but because you've learned what doesn't require force. That knowledge tends to arrive quietly after enough experience has made its point. There's often a moment near the end of a year when you realize you're no longer waiting for it to end. The urgency dissolves. What remains is a steady awareness that the transition is already happening with or without your involvement. That realization brings a kind of ease that doesn't need encouragement. You might sense that your inner rhythm feels more trustworthy now. Not faster, not slower, just more aligned. That alignment isn't something you created intentionally. It formed as you adapted, adjusted, paused, and continued again and again through months that asked for more patience than explanation. This year may have taught you that peace isn't something you arrive at once and keep forever. It appears in intervals. It settles in briefly, then returns when invited again. And now you recognize it more easily when it's here. That recognition matters. As the morning continues, there's no need to frame this moment as meaningful. Meaning has a way of forming later when it's no longer needed to orient yourself. For now, there's enough in simply noticing how little is required to be here. You may feel a quiet readiness not to begin something new, but to allow continuity, to let one day follow another without commentary, to trust that whatever needs attention will make itself known in time. The year doesn't need a closing statement. It doesn't need to be honored or summarized. It simply finishes the way breath finishes an exhale, making room without announcing it. We can let that be enough. The year feels ready to be set down now. Not because everything has been understood, but because nothing is asking to be carried further. What remains doesn't need words anymore. It's already here in the way attention rests, in the way the body knows it can soften. There's no need to look back again. Nothing new needs to be gathered from what has passed. The morning continues on its own, Light moves, breath follows breath.